Good morning and welcome to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, gentlemen. Happy Tuesday to you.
Happy Tuesday.
Yeah, good morning.
The week has started in full.
That it has. Tommy's gotten
Didn't it start yesterday,
had some crazy weather last night, so hence why we're running a little late today.
and I'm amazed that some of us, I'm not going to say who, don't adhere to policies around what you should do around.
Okay, come on. You've been in this podcast long enough, Tommy.
Come on, man.
Who's
Come
the one who's going to follow the rules? Seth and Tommy. Who's the one who's not going to follow the rules?
I'm going to
Mike.
follow the don't die rules. Really,
It's Tommy. It's just the difference between the folks that stand right at their front door and videotape the tornado coming towards them, and the folks that are in the basement.
That's true.
You know,
I don't video it. So give you some context here. What we were talking about. We were talking about before the call started here, or if we started doing the Explicit Measure podcast. Tommy was like, "Hey, sorry, I'm a little tired. I was up and down a lot last night. The tornado warnings were happening, and so I was up and down and waking up and going to the basement and coming up because the warnings were happening." And I was like, "You go downstairs to the basement for warnings?" Like, I wait till it starts ripping trees out of the ground. Yeah,
siren.
I wait until the sirens. So
I wait till I hear the freight train.
Exactly.
Sound of the.
I wait till the
wind
refrigerator
whipping.
goes right through the window.
Exactly. Then I know it's time to go downstairs.
It's breaking.
So I was like, we don't usually go downstairs. Maybe we'll pay attention. Like when the sirens go on, that's when the phones go on. I put my phone on. I'll look very intently on the phone, but I don't. We don't really run to the basement every single time. So, anyways,
You're amazing me with that because I just think I don't know. It's a tornado. It's like. And then your kids wake up, your phone goes off. Like all the things are happening, even if the tornado doesn't come.
That's what I'm saying. If it was coming, there would be like, there's definitely something on Twitter that's going to show you people, things are going to be flying around. So check out that a little bit. And
Twitter.
I'll go to the National Weather Service.
The last thing I want to look
touchdowns.
at before I die is not Twitter.
Every other day in here, we get a warning from Walworth County has more tornadoes. Walworth County, every county. That's the county not to live in here in our area. For whatever reason, every storm that comes through, they have a tornado. It's like a given. So I don't live in Walworth County, so we're good. We're safe.
Okay.
All that's tongue in cheek too as well. So jumping into that's our kind of our input here. Our main article today is talking about an article by SQL BI, which I thought was very relevant. It's the 330-300 rule. So it kind of gives you a little bit more of a 330-300 rule. And Kurt Bueller, who is now, I believe, is hired by SQL BI to kind of write some more articles, is doing an amazing job building incredible graphics, really good reports, and just really articulating some very solid points here that I'd like to just kind of walk through and think through how do we utilize this pattern to help us think more deeply about what we're building on our reports. So that I think is very relevant here. And another talking point around building great visualization things. The articles, as always, are in the link in the description below. So if you want to see the full articles and links, there'll be a description below. With that, let's jump into the news. I'm very excited about some things here, and I'm going to throw this out here to the world, and we'll see what people say. I'm very excited about the GitHub integration. So one thing that Microsoft has been working on a lot recently was, hey, we want to give you a better way of controlling the versions of your reports. How does a team work together? How can you edit a portion of a report and merge it with other people's changes? There's really no collaboration on these multiple artifacts here. How do I edit a semantic model and make sure that the changes aren't breaking things? So with this, Microsoft has been hardening the report side formatting called the PBIP format. And with that, we've been getting a whole bunch of really interesting changes. And now, when you publish things to the service, PowerBI.com, you now can use GitHub. So before, you could only use Azure DevOps, and now GitHub is also included. Initial thoughts and reactions. I love this feature. I think this is the way to go.
If we were a radio show and we had special sound effects, this is when you would hear the applause, celebration, music, like the horse going down the road and everyone cheering, exactly kind of thing. Whatever that sound effect calls for, this is that time. For me, this is really, I think, important because I think we've talked about this before. Git is hard enough, and then if anyone's usually getting
Get out of here.
Get out of here. Yeah, that's what people usually say when they see it. They're like, what is this? Hey, get out.
Here.
But then you have to now also learn DevOps and get started with DevOps, which I would challenge is also on top of just learning Git, something else that's also very foreign, especially because most people are starting with GitHub. This is going to make it a lot easier and the barrier to entry a lot lower for most people out there. And then for a lot of us, I'm a Git heavy person. Especially with GitHub. DevOps is fine. And obviously we've made it work in a lot of situations.
You've used it. Yep.
But it's not my choice.
It's not your first choice.
Right, kind of thing, because of how much I use
you.
GitHub with everything else.
Yeah.
So this is a major deal.
So there's some really interesting patterns that are starting to evolve, and we had some questions kind of come along our radar, and this is also probably coming a little bit around the beat from the street as well. I'm going to bleed into that a little bit, but there's a lot of interesting patterns you can use with Azure DevOps and GitHub. And just to be clear, it's not difficult to use them. It's more of like, can you set them up initially correctly? And then once they're set up, you don't have to go into the tools again. You can basically you can live your entire life inside powerbi.com and check things in and make changes there. So you can, if you need a pure, simple way of backing up your artifacts or backing up things and going straight to Git without having to have SharePoint or other things as well, you can just use these things. These tools are there, they exist. You can just work normally like your normal workflow would be, and you can check things in. So I really like that part. But I'm also finding now that when you are using a team of people, we have this concept of the people who are developing the reports and the models and the other artifacts, data engineers, data scientists, they're doing things in the workspace. Potentially there's someone here that is doing the release management. They're the individual that's in charge, or a persona that's in charge of taking things from dev to test to production. And what we're finding is inside Azure DevOps and inside GitHub, you can protect certain things. For example, you can require that no one can make any changes until they have a minimum of 2 reviewers on a pull request, which means that's basically a merge of some information back into a main branch. This is really interesting because it really has changed a lot of like the best practices that you could use for reviewing and getting reports out the door. So it's quite interesting to see how diverse and how much more control we potentially have as a team that could be impacted by this. So I'm really excited about that, actually, in my opinion.
Well, and I think there's going to be some of the open source community thing too, because you're right. There's a lot, to your point, there's a lot of methods and approaches.
It's like process. There's a lot more process you can apply.
There's a lot more processes. But
because
now,
you'd want to say, like, look, I don't want Tommy just checking code in whenever he wants. I want someone to look at it. So, like, we want a Seth to review the code before it goes back into a branch. Well, now you can enforce that. It can be required.
Well, I mean, you could have done that with DevOps too.
Yes, I'm not saying it, but I'm just saying, like, I'm exploring the idea of like development pipelines. I'm exploring the idea of all these other tools.
I see.
And so, like, before it was just, hey, look, I can check in the code. Now it's like, what does my process look like to check in the code? Is there more to this that I didn't see before? And so now I'm getting like deeper questions around companies that are like organizations that say, look, we don't want to break things. We need people to review things. This is going to be part of our process. What can DevOps or GitHub help us to do those things? So there's all these kind of extra things that are coming along with this as well.
Well, and also now from the open source point of view, I have this feeling you're going to see a lot of this sharing where, hey, Mike, I have these few reports I've been working on. It's a public Git repo. Go ahead and clone it or fork it, add that to your workspace, and all of a sudden it's done. So we have a lot more of the open source part here that I'm also really excited about.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting thing there.
DevOps thing, which is very interesting.
Say that again.
Or you're talking about this DevOps thing here with the pipelines. I'm a little intrigued.
Yeah, it doesn't actually, believe it or not, it doesn't only exist in DevOps. GitHub also has a series of additional items and elements that you can also use inside GitHub. So there's almost the same features you can use in Azure DevOps are the same features that can be utilized in GitHub. You can require there's more than one reviewer. You can protect a main branch of a code library, so that way people can't just check things in. It has to go through a reviewing system. There's a whole bunch of other things you can have automated tests running.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is really interesting because I haven't seen a lot of the community yet producing a lot of comments or IP around or code around how do I automatically test these models or reports using these pipelines. John Kursky is one of the ones that I know that is doing a ton of this. So very excited to see where John's going to take some of this stuff. To your point, Tommy, I'm much more of a GitHub fan. It seems a much more lightweight than the Azure DevOps. It's a little simpler from a management of users and permissions and things as well. So I'm very excited to kind of really dive deeper into GitHub and feel like that's the right approach for a lot of organizations because there are pretty much GitHub-based companies.
Also
So anyways,
works a lot better with VS Code too. Not everyone's a VS Code person here. We know that. However,
I'm with you on that one as well. Yeah, it totally makes sense. The last thing I'll point out here from this blog article that I'm very excited about is the very end. There is a couple little tags here. There's a little phrase here that says, working with GitHub and Fabric. Beyond the different authentication required, working with GitHub will have similar functionality that is available today when working in Git integration with Fabric. You'll be able to prompt users for changes. You'll commit and update using the source control pane. You'll see the branching out. You'll be able to switch for branchings. You'll be able to switch branches as well. And then finally, you'll be able to use the Fabric Git APIs will become available in the next few weeks for GitHub users as well. And this is really interesting to me because this is what we needed. We need code to help us produce the process that we're trying to build here. Commit to Git, connect, Git connection, Git status, initialize connection, update from Git. These are standard connections that we need or API calls that we need to go talk to Power.com. So again, also excited that there's now a whole Git layer of APIs that we're going to be able to look at and use that'll help us interact with this service as well. So very excited about that as well.
My last nerdy thing here is you can also now use the GitHub API, which has its own GitHub Copilot command line tool where if you're like, hey, I don't know how to do something, but I know I need to do it and I'm on the terminal.
Yes.
You can go out, you can ask your terminal and say, hey, clone this repo or fork this repo of mine.
Yep.
Done.
Boom.
So
completed. Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that I like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. I don't have any other really major announcements. Any other announcements, Tommy, that you found that came out on the blog or anything else you want to pick up on?
Nope.
I think there was something else something just got released today. Let me just double check real quick here. Blog.fabric. Something else came out. I didn't have a chance to look at it. Fabric Data Pipelines, Advanced Scheduling Techniques, Part 2. Kind of like a little bit of a detail on how to more advanced schedule your items. I do think this is very relevant. Honestly, I have run into some errors or some issues where I want to run a pipeline once a month, once a week, a specific day of the week, those kind of things as well. So just check out the blog. This is a really interesting article. I do think this is you can use dynamic conditions for an if condition on an activity. So they're giving you some more capabilities now to give you a bit more color or context around how you want to run your pipelines. Anyways, I found this article interesting, super technical. Just be aware. There's a lot of code in there. And if you're not heavily using pipelines, this may not be as relevant for you. But I did find this interesting. And this is a challenge that I have seen in the past. And it's nice that they're solving this now. All right. With that, let's see what time we're at here. We got a little bit more time. So I'm going to give you one of my quick, I'll call this is our beat from the street standpoint. We've been doing a little bit of exploration ourselves. And to go on that vein of Git and Git integration, we've been doing some experiments around what kind of items or what kind of artifacts are able to move through a deployment pipeline. Okay, so we're talking about Git and GitHub. That's all interesting. But if you look at Microsoft documentation, they would recommend that everything in the development workspace is attached to your Git. Test and production are not attached to your Git repo. They are purely, they stand alone, and they are copies of artifacts that live in your test workspace. And you use the deployment pipeline to kind of promote content between the different areas. Some of the things I've been finding and initially looking at this is I had to do some more investigation on this, so it's not fully fleshed out yet. But depending on what kind of artifact you're using, for example, data flows Gen 2 do not move through a deployment pipeline. You can't move them through. You can't check them into Git. So there's some challenges there with certain artifacts that are not fully supported in the deployment pipelines. And in addition to that, you have to think about each of these artifacts, every pipeline, every notebook, every data flow, they may be pointing to a single lakehouse. I don't think all the capability, and this is where I'm testing things right now, I'm finding that there's certain artifacts, such as like a data flow Gen 2, when you move it from dev to test, it's not immediately being repointed to the lakehouse that's inside the test environment. So even though I've moved something between environments, it still points to the old artifacts. This, I think, needs to be fixed a little bit. There needs to be some more things like, there needs to be the ability to like kind of manage these connections as well. It almost like the connection to these different sources of information need to be independently managed from the actual artifact itself. And that way you could have, how do we solve this in CI/CD pipelines? We solve this by making like an independent file or database or table where we look up the connection string that we need depending on what environment we're coming from. So the connection strings can change. And so each artifact you build has to be kind of dynamic in the fact that go find the definition of what I need to connect to, go find where my lakehouse exists, and then connect to that, then do my job. So there's this whole really interesting connection piece that I think is not quite fleshed out yet, and it's still a little bit clunky in my opinion. Have you experienced the same thing, Tommy?
Yeah, I was about to say, do you like we have a few tests right now actually with the best practice, the one Git and the deployment pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that. Like, it's very frustrating to go back to both systems, and I want to see, like, do you like that, or does it feel like, what's your own experience with utilizing that one workspace with Git and then everything else with deployment pipelines? Because my opinion,
it's a good question.
Yeah.
I feel like this is something that so I'm going to get very technical here for a moment. Inside a Git repo, you have this thing called GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions has a folder that is created when you use these. It's called .github. It's a very specific folder that contains the actions inside the repo where you store settings that go along with that repo. It tells you things about that pipeline or what's happening in that repo. I think we need something very similar. I think if you think about this, I mean, what I'm thinking in my mind is, look, I would like to control through the Git. I would like to control all of the settings for each of the individual workspaces and then link, okay, this workspace uses these connections, the second workspace uses those connections, and the third workspace uses different connections, right? So if I'm thinking about this, I would like the Git repo or however we're storing our information to capture all this. What deployment pipelines are kind of doing, when you make a deployment pipeline for a semantic model and you add variables or parameters there, you can go create the semantic model, move it to the test environment, and you can change. There's a gear in the deployment pipeline. You can switch the settings of the configuration for that connection. So you can adjust it. Awesome, which is what you want. But I don't want that stored inside a deployment pipeline as an arbitrary, I had to go click a button and set it. I want that to be a file or some kind of config file that lives per environment or something along those lines. And then I can go pick up and pre-build or build that and manage it with code. Does that make sense, Tommy, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and couldn't you now do that technically?
I'm not sure yet. And that's where
it's going to a GitHub repo. It would follow all the rules of a GitHub repo.
But that's just for the development environment. What I want, I want the deployment pipeline to consume an artifact, a file, a settings configuration, something there that it doesn't exist. And so what I find myself doing is I have to go point to something that's like a third party or, there's a separate lakehouse that doesn't exist in my pipeline that I have to go read data from to then determine what environment I'm in and then how to set the connection string. So that's
where things get very janky right now, because
it is.
You feel very smooth with your first workspace utilizing the repo, but you're like, okay, this is all familiar. And then you have to change your rules and change your process once you get the deployment pipeline, because now you have to now deal with the technology once you go to the pipeline.
Yes and no. Like I'm not worried about changing the process. I mean, I'm actually okay. I mean, for smaller organizations, I think this makes sense.
Yeah.
I think you're going to very quickly find that people are going to not use deployment pipelines at all. And instead, people will just say, I'm going to build a repo and I will have multiple branches. There'll be a single branch for the development environment. There'll be a single branch for the test.
repos.
And there'll be a single branch for production. So I think people are going to do this differently. They might manage this other ways. I'm already in my mind starting to figure out there are many patterns that you could use, but they all have their trade-offs.
Well, this has been my argument. The deployment pipelines were for Git for people who didn't have Git.
Correct. Agree. And now that we have it, how do we better use it? And I don't know if I don't know if we're there yet. I think the deployment pipelines needs to go through a bit of a rebuild, a rethink a little bit.
A repolish
it now. It needs a little bit more polishing now to what we actually need to have it be built
TLR.
as.
Yeah.
Yeah.
TLC. Yeah.
TLDR.
Tender love and care.
Tender. That's not it. Too long didn't read.
Not the band, not the musical band.
So I actually do have a beat from the street, and it's a question. As part of your overall reporting solutions, how often are you generating data dumps and sending them into an email?
Oh.
Okay, well, I'm going to say, how often am I getting asked to do that versus how often am I doing that?
Correct. And
so that becomes
I'm getting asked all the time to do data dumps. Anyone who talks to anything Power BI is, how do I get all this data out in this table form? The ask is all the time. Do I give that to them? No, I try to educate and show them there's an overview, like we're building. And I am pushing more clearly towards, if you want insights on data, that's a report. Let's talk about summarizing the data and helping you figure out the big picture. And then when you want data dumps, I'm saying it's definitely paginated reports. And paginated reports now comes with parameters. You can build it in the service, which is way easier than the stupid little desktop app you get to use. It's so hard to build a parameter in the desktop.
So when I last worked internally, which I think is probably the most best way to look at this, when I first started, it's probably 45% of request, where we need an email. Things were already happening that way. So
I would say it's higher. That's a low number. I would say. I think it would be higher than that.
Is that because there was no? Is that because there was no access to the data? Or
no, the data was there.
Yeah.
It was in a Power BI report. So all the data was already accessible. Yeah. It wasn't because it was inaccessible. So we went through each of those, and those were one of the main priorities on, to your point, educating those teams going, there's a better way. Okay, they're like, well, we don't like clicking on this. We could change that. So those became our priorities to get them to the service, get them somewhere else where it didn't exist in Excel file. By the time I decided to, become start my own band.
Cut the cheese.
Cut the cheese.
Split in the run.
That happens all no. By the time I decided to start the consulting firm, we were probably down to maybe 2 or 3%, or 2 or 3 actually emails that were going out, just because like people found a better experience in a different way, and rather than the data dump.
What are some reasons why you don't want to do that?
So probably the biggest one is, where does the data live, the source of truth? You're making a copy of the data in a raw file, which someone's going to try to now explain or interpret. Rather, they really want a snapshot of the data. They want a way to explain the data on that day. The Excel file, the CSV, or the PDF does not allow someone to actually interact with it. Doesn't allow someone to actually interpret it. They still have to do their own calculations, especially if it's the data dump. But again, when you end up asking people, what do you really want? They don't want rows and rows of data. That's not their end goal. They really want a snapshot of something pre-baked for them. So let's bring them to the source of truth. Let's pre-bake that for them with the least amount of clicks possible that's already connected to the data of the organization. Because again, the data dump simply just becomes their own interpretation of that raw data.
Okay, so that's one aspect. The others, I think, are education of how to use the tools, right? Because I'd
agree with that.
You're losing traction towards like data culture, data maturity kind of levels. You're adding resource pressure depending on how much you're doing this and how widespread. And I think one of the biggest things for me is you lose track of who's using the report. There's no visibility into like actual usage. So the reason I bring this up is I ran into a business use case recently that I wanted to throw out a caution for. Did you know that in Power Automate, you can generate
A whole ton.
a file off of a Power BI report and email it?
Yeah,
Mhm.
DAX query. Yep.
Not even. You
It
can
just does it for you.
connect to the Power BI report.
Yeah.
Just like somebody builds a table and then boom, dumps. So I wasn't aware of this, and it was nice that the business user was like had made a request, because for changes to an existing report, and Tommy, this aligned with the report existed, the filters were there, the end users just didn't know how to go like click on the filters and save their filter set.
Mm-hmm.
And or his ultimate solution was just to create a bookmark page that had the slices of information for the end users, which is still much better than where he was going, which was apparently the logical reasoning went, well, we don't know, like we've had problems with user adoption because they don't know how to use the reports. So we're going to ensure that they can use them by emailing them. And I just like, I was scratching my head a little bit, and it just, well, if you want to ensure adoption, train them on how to
Tell
use
them the
report.
link of the
show
report.
them where to go and what to do, and you actually have then an understanding of user adoption. Because if this is a big need of the business, the Power BI service lets you know who's using the report.
My
So
goodness.
like an interesting point, right? Like if you have Power Automate as an accessible feature in your business, maybe it's an area you would want to explore if you're going down the data culture route and determine how many emails are actually being sent with data dumps.
I wonder if this comes up in the activities log, Seth. I'd be honest. I'd be curious to see if that's an activity that's appearing there from an automated system, because I would have to imagine if it's hitting anything in the Power BI service, that could be an activity that's appearing.
There's a Power BI Automate, I think, activity.
I think so. And I think that might be something that would be like, you would probably see a very large spike on those, either turning
Because
on or
it would
ramping up.
essentially be somebody building their own ETL pipeline to extract data from your reports, which is kind of not where you want to be.
I know.
No.
Like I get it from a data access issue, but I would also argue, Mike, we can do that with paginated, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I suppose if you have a complete self-service solution, maybe you intentionally build in this direction for certain use cases, but not in use cases where the data is there, the data is accessible.
Yes.
And what are we trying to do with the reports when we build them, which I think is a good segue into the 330.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up too, because to your point with the segue to the report, we talk about Fabric and Git and all of these advanced tooling, but organizations and still people today are still dealing with things around Power BI, around data culture that are always going to be there. These things are not going away just because the technology is changing. So don't mean to get a little emotional, but I think I love the fact that I don't love the fact these things are still happening, but
Tommy, I think you make a really good point though. The fact that you were able to, so here's what I think the moral of this story I feel like is, one, you need to be able to understand, is it happening? Because Seth, you kind of heard about it from a ticket, right? That's kind of not where we want to be listening and hearing these things come from. Rather, we would rather have some sort of reporting or, listening to the activities log and say, wait a minute, monthly I'm reviewing our metrics and man, there's an activity that I was not expecting. What is that activity? And at least triggering enough interest to go, okay, let's go figure out what that thing is. And then you can say, okay, well, now I can see that this automated Power Automate thing is regularly hitting stuff. Let's go find out where that comes from. Right. So, and to your point, Seth, I think it's more of a culture shift or a behavioral thing. And again, I really like your example, Timely. 40 to 45 to 50% of your people were just getting, I just need the data to dump out, because they're taking it and putting it somewhere else or doing something else with it. When that is happening, it's really an opportunity to come back and say, show me what you're doing. Show me why this is occurring. And then from there, you can kind of step back and say, here's a better way of doing this. Let me educate you on probably what you're doing already exists inside PowerBI.com, so you don't have to export it. And if I really do need a snapshot of every piece of day that has data that going into it, let me know. And let's build a better mousetrap for, okay, here's the snapshot of the data as it was today. Here's the snapshot of the data as it was last week. And honestly, when I see things that are snapshotting data, it's not really valuable. The things that people work on top of that, they just want to have record of what was at this older point in time.
Right.
It doesn't really matter.
And that falls into like the position direction thing. Like, oh, great, you have snapshots. What are you doing with it? Well, every once in a while, or actually the value is in comparison to a different time range.
Correct.
At which point, let us just build that for you.
Yeah, let us build this time.
Let us build that snapshot, like the view of how things are changing over time. It's called a line chart, and we're already snapshotting all the data, so we can tell you what's going on. Yeah,
we work a lot with transportation companies, and or things where there is a set date and time when something needs to leave. Think of like the train leaving the station, or think about the airplane leaving the airport. Right, it's going to fly. There are companies out there that want to make sure that hardware, that plane, boat, train, whatever, that thing needs to be filled up as much as they can with all the people, all the boxes, all that they can, because that maximizes their profit. There's a lot of reporting around, okay, what was the status in time of how filled up was my item? This is exactly what you're talking about, Seth. It's that experience of, I need to see that trend,
right,
to how filled, how completely, are we behind trend? Are we ahead of trend? Do we need to add more discounts? What do we have to do to get this thing filled up? So this is a really good point. It's very relevant for data reporting, but it really changes how you model the data. And that might just be, the business can't communicate back to the data people or the engineering. What do you really need? How do you want to build this pattern? Very good points. I love it. All right, we burned through a lot of time talking through intro topics. This was really good. Thank you very much. It was really good, bringing good topics here. Let's give homage to our article here today. So SQL BI, Kurt Bueller is describing the 3, the 30, and the 300 role. Tommy, you want to give us just a quick little overview of maybe some of the key points you're seeing at the top of the article here?
Yeah.
And we'll jump in from there.
So Kurt continues to be on fire from an article point of view. If he was a basketball player, this would be Seth Curry. So we're talking about the 3, 30, 300 rule, and it's also known as what we'll call the visual information seeking mantra, which is really a strategy for organizing reports in a way that allows users to quickly and efficiently find the information they need. And the idea is we have 3 seconds, 30 seconds, and 300 seconds. Users should be able to find information around each of those time frames, and what they're finding is different. So that's kind of, I think, pretty just a way to introduce this. And to me, I've never heard this from the books that I read from my own knowledge center, so to speak. So this is a very interesting way to look at things, because usually we look at things around each report is dedicated to one thing. But if we could put this all in one report, this is a little pretty cool.
So I'm going to point on this article basically hinges on a white paper from Ben Schneiderman, is how I'm going to say his name, from a Department of Computer Science out of College Park in Maryland. So this is not like they came up with this like willy-nilly, like, out of thin air. Like, this is like a very detailed, like, someone has studied it. And this is one of my points around data visualization pieces. A lot of people I'll ask in interviews, where did you get your information from? How do you learn how to pick a bar chart versus this versus that? There's actually a lot of studied material of people in universities studying graphics and visual design. You should be able to go find other people's research and just adopt it and look at it. This is, I think, kind of what we're looking at here. So Ben did a great job in the article. Kurt is summarizing this and actually putting it into practice on a report.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me is I had to look up, is this 330, 300 thing, like, is that a technology thing? Is this something they just came up with? So it's actually, like, I guess comes out of urban for greening, like a forestry kind of thing. That was the only reference I could find in 2021. There was a gentleman called Cecil Konijnjek.
I'll go with it.
But the process,
better than I would do.
Essentially, his thing was like at least 3 trees in sight from every home, school, and workplace, at least 30% tree canopy in every neighborhood, and no more than 300 meters between every home and nearest park or green space. The only reference I could find. So I like what they did in terms of like finding something that is easy to conceptualize, right? First, and I think aligns to a lot of what you're referencing, Mike, which is a lot of the data and visualization space, right?
Mhm.
Which we dabble in as data people that do visualization, but
Yes.
there are many others that do visualization as a career, illustration, like especially like infographics for newspapers, et cetera, like consolidating down an immense amount of information into a very simple form.
Mhm.
And what the 33300 speaks to me is, and what they outline in the article is aligning these like seconds to a lot of the way we digest information, right? So if you align this to like the Gestalt principles that we've talked about, we've had, done presentations and many things on,
Yep.
it's all in what are the things that you're doing from a visual standpoint to elicit a reaction in the way that you would want to from the end user. And typically, right, you have a what are they, like pre-attentive attributes, right? Like things that just pop out in the page. And one of the things I'll walk through is like color and positioning and all of the things that I think we've obviously also done a lot of the research on to build the theme generator and all the things that help out
Tons.
with these things.
Yes.
Is there's a process by which the vast majority of like English speaking, people read from left to right and like how you want to design your page. And I think they just did a really good job of like reshaping that into a package that, is a little bit more focused on the report build instead of adding in a lot of these other learnings and things from a different space.
There's some very critical points you're putting here, Seth. And again, I'm loving today's episode because even if Microsoft and the technology changes, the people don't. And we're talking about fundamental aspects here that have not changed since Power BI has been out and will not change no matter what Power BI becomes. Users can struggle with what they see. And also, hopefully, we have the skills to design. What you're talking to is that iconic short-term and long-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
And really that first aspect, this is one of the things I do on training. Mike, we might actually have the same slides here on kind of iconic memory. And that's just the idea of before things you even realize things even get to your brain, they're in your brain, and the amount of information flooding in.
Your brain's always trying to summarize things.
Right.
Like immediately it's trying to summarize.
Right.
Yes.
And if you're trying to say, okay, how do I know what's actually sticking in my brain? Look at the wall real quick. Close your eyes. What stood out? And there are reasons why that red color or that triangle with maybe that wasn't perfectly aligned stands out.
Yeah.
And when we do our visualizations, this is the same aspect here. So in that 3-second rule, don't expect people to understand the whole report or understand all the data in there or where you want them to look. Because if you have things aligned or you have something conditionally highlighted in the bottom right, that's where people are going to focus. And so talking just about where do we want people to start? Where do we want them to guide them without necessarily verbally telling them or logically telling them? That's going to be happening because of this iconic memory.
Yes. And to be also very clear here as well, like Kurt's doing a great job. This article is very deep. It goes into like very detailed, like here's some examples. Here's some, this pulls on a lot of other areas, and I don't see them actually pulling this out very, very in the very detailed way in the article, but they're talking about a lot of the good Gestalt principles, right? Go from the top left to the bottom right, because that's how people generally read. Most of the world reads in that fashion. Using color, avoid extra ink and other unneeded information. Simplify the message, right? Keep it simple. And so there's a lot of Gestalt principles in here. So again, a lot of these things that are in this article, I think, are really good places to guide yourself by. And I really like the examples of you talking about the detail. This is another area that I thought Kurt does a great job of architecting really simple ideas with graphics. And so he does a really good job of like explaining, like at a pyramid level, here's the highest, most summarized detail, total sales, right? And it goes down in detail, lower, 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 until you get more grain of the data into you, so you can explain, okay, what region, what product type, all the different things that potentially will be contributing to that sales being up or down. So I really like the infographic pieces that live in this article as well. Kurt's done an amazing job. And he also does examples of here's a report that does not follow the 3, the 30, the 300 rule, because this is where having real examples of this, I think, really help people understand, like, yeah, this is not what we're trying to do here. And then he gives a counter example of, here's another example of the 3, the 300 rule. And one area that they didn't point out in the article, they didn't really put in there, in maybe they talked about it, but I didn't see it very clearly called out, was aligning objects. They have a lot of bar charts in the acceptable reports. They align them from the most negative to the most positive. So this is a really key point. And when I learned a lot about visualization, it was thinking a lot about position and direction. Where am I right now? And what direction is our business heading? Is that what we want? Because just putting in a single number of, 1.6 billion in revenue, that tells you nothing. You don't have anything to refer to it. There's no reference point to say, is that better? Would we expect to be higher, or would we expect to be lower? And I think reporting really starts becoming actionable when you start adding budget and expectations and what you want to be at. And when those numbers start appearing in your reports, that's when people can really make decisions, because we can say we're 10% behind or 10% ahead. That's when we start changing behavior of people, because we need to change what we're doing so we can sell more or reallocate.
Yeah. And I think the visual example is a good one, because both it uses the same format, it uses the same theme, the same layout, right? The only difference is really how you're presenting information on the page. And I think it's a stark example of, yes, does the top report look good still? Yeah, it does. However, it's information overload. You're not guiding the user into the different particular areas that are kind of leaned into in a learning path here, or what we're talking about is some of these principles and like how people interact with data. And that's the, I think, linchpin behind some of the simplification that we need to do in the visualization. And I think that's what I like about this article, is it drives into those key points without a lot of the detail that you can talk about. But one of those things is, like, for, like I said, English speaking, right? Left to right, left to right, down, top to bottom. But in cultures where you're not reading that way, maybe it's the opposite, right? So it's the direction by which people usually digest information. Large, like, different font or colors that pop, or the things that like are the most important on the page, are typically the ones where your eyes want to go immediately. And one of the things I used to do when I was actively building a lot of reports is pull it up full screen on my computer and walk a distance away, talk to somebody, break my attention, and then look back.
Yes.
And where do my eyes go first, without, like, because the information, the data. So sometimes you cheat yourself and you're like, oh yeah, it's right there. But can you see it like from an abstract perspective? And it's really interesting just from a design elements perspective to go, oh dang, like actually my eyes are drawn to the middle right, or to the lower right first. I might want to change or lighten up my matrix a little bit, and then bold my colors over in this direction, because that's where I want to focus people's attention first.
And I'm just going to emphasize what Seth is saying here. That's usually the hardest thing for a lot of people starting out. If I were to ask both of you your own journey in data visualization, probably that's the case where we're in depth. We're the ones under the microscope looking at our own reports. So yeah, we know what it means. But to try to break away and look at that with fresh eyes is very difficult. So I just want to emphasize what Seth is saying. For a lot of users, if you still feel like you struggle with this, if you're still relatively new, this is a great exercise to do. Is very much either getting someone else or breaking your own attention, walking away from it, and then trying to look at it again. And it's still hard, because again, you're the one intimate with the data. You're the one intimate with what the visuals look like, because you built it. You're the one doing the conditional formatting and all of the aspects of it. So where all the bells and whistles are. Getting an outside view or getting your head outside of what it already is can very much change how you're going to design it or what you actually designed.
Yeah. So as you walk through like kind of their guidelines, and I'll just read through them quick for the audience here, right? Focus on specific questions, right? This is that requirement gathering, the focusing on the business. Go from top left to bottom right. Use color to steer attention. Limit ink and information. Keep it simple. Make it convenient. Which one of these for you guys is the most difficult to accomplish?
Ooh, great question. I think I find myself trying to put information on the page. I find so many things intriguing and don't necessarily narrow down on a single one or two main key questions that we're trying to dive into. I have to do a lot of work. I feel like internally I'm doing a lot of work of what's most important to me, because that sometimes changes depending on how I feel for the day, and over time that will change. Like, for example, let me just give you a real world example of how I use this today. I have our internal reporting. I have a team of people who are working on projects. I need to know how many hours everyone has spent on every project. And so when I initially built my report to do my internal reporting, it had a lot of things on the main page. Now, after using that report, I probably would use 2 or 3 main visuals that indicate to me like where I need to be in order to say, am I on track? Am I off track? Do I need to change some behaviors? Do I need to go talk to somebody? So over time, like my initial opinion of what I thought my report was going to look like in the first version probably had too much. Yeah. And so there is times where I'm still looking at that summary stuff and then driving down deeper in the page. So what I have adopted for what I'm using is the window that I'm using. My report is extremely long, and I have the key information. I can bring up the report, immediately look at my top part of the page and know exactly, am I on track? Do I have things? And then what I can do then still is, if I need to scroll down the page, I can then scroll deeper to the page, and that's where my detailed tables are living.
You scroll still?
I still scroll. I mean, it's just a really long report because I didn't want to have to click back and forth between pages. I wanted to see the detail, but I didn't want it initially. I want the summary at the top. Okay. So it's almost like a web page more than it is like a report. Yeah. And that's one thing that I like to use in some of my reporting is everyone uses 16:9 ratio on reporting. It's just a very standard thing. You can get away from that a little bit. You can adjust that a little bit. Not for everyone.
By 1200, baby.
Not for everyone, but you can do the 16:9 ratio, but you don't always have to do that one. Yeah. So that would be me. Yeah. I struggle limiting the most important information and then appropriately building the detailed pages behind it. That's where I spend most of my time working, because I know that's a weakness.
Yeah. To your point. Tell me, what about you?
Well, first, 3 of my my report template has 3 pages. None of them are standard size. They're all slightly larger. But I would say, Mike, it used to be what you talked about in terms of too much information. But for right now, I would say where I would most want to improve is going from that top left to bottom right, or really the segue from your most important visual, that first 3 seconds, to where do you go from here? What is the most or next most permanent information that you want to show a user? Because we might have that highlighted information of good or bad, but there are usually so many avenues you can go, and it's very dependent on how much information you've gotten already from your stakeholders or you've gotten in that discovery on what's important. Because again, your initial aspect is always to go to something trending, but I really do hate just a normal trending line chart now, because usually anything you're looking at over 6 months may be helpful once, but is not going to cause someone to go back to report next week, because it doesn't change a lot. So where do you go from here that can be important for either that 3 or 30 seconds, but is also going to give the user enough information, right? Because you can filter things out of context. But again, it may not give that all the information that a user is looking for.
Yes. Great, that one too.
I think mine roll into 2, but it primarily lands on Mike's. I typically can lay things out in such a way that I'm drawing the attention where I need it or want it to be. But the keep it simple, it creates this challenge of a balance between how many pages versus adding potentially a little complexity on other pages. So maybe I'm intentionally adding a bit more, because in simplistic form, even in the example, you only have so many visualizations on a page, right? Like, because otherwise you start to overload, which I think they do a good example of. Like, there's a ton of metrics that are just stacked on top of each other in card form, right? Like, and it's really hard to digest all that. Would I add that many? No, right? But there's this balance between, okay, well, if I need to produce all of these insights, how do I break that apart in the pages? And we've talked about this a lot. I think a standard one that goes really well is having a summary and analysis and potentially a detail page, right? You can do drill through, you can do different things like that. But that's just like a basic. Still, you're going to be challenged with like, how many things and what insights do you need to provide? And where all of a sudden that makes sense in a simple form can easily draw you into, well, that makes sense in this realm, but I would readjust things if I'm going to use it by region, and I would like change these things. Okay, so now I'm on another page, or I could add in these other two visuals, and now it's a little busy, but so there's always this kind of push and pull of like the right amount of information for an end user. But and I think as part of that is also challenge this like focus on the specific questions. Right. So you're trying to solve these problems with the end user in mind.
Yes.
And you're making specific decisions to say, I'm answering these questions on these pages. The other thing that I've found extremely challenging, if you don't do as a piece of advice, is track that. Like, even if you do no other tracking mechanism, like add a page into the Power BI report that says this page delivers these insights or answers these questions, because inevitably what's going to happen is, as users begin to use the report, like someone else is going to say, I'd really like to see this. I want you to add this. I want you to modify whatever. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, if you don't know what the purpose behind the report build and page was, you're now going to confuse or muddle the issue, like muddle what's on the page, and you like lose the like potential insights that you're driving for, because there was a specific reason why you omitted certain information or did not include it. And it is a hell of a conversation 6 to 9 months down the road to look at a report when somebody's like, well, why do we build it this way? And you
these
don't
are the questions we were trying to answer with that.
So that's where I say, like, those two have always like continue to present challenges as you're going through and building reports. I do love that, like, as I just read off these like top level like build processes, the rest of the article dives into the details of gathering requirements and understanding the user questions, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the two that really stand out to me, even in the continuing build process that I go through.
Speaking of which, I feel like we should give some love to the middle child here, because I think like anyone who has 3 kids, the first gets most of the attention, the third takes care of itself, and that middle child, I think, sometimes just doesn't get the attention it needs, and that's that 30-second area. The reason I say that is we've all probably learned or put our most knowledge around how to deal with grabbing people's attention. And to both your points, that 300 seconds, the extra details on demand, those are our tables, and we probably do that without even thinking. But that middle area of how do we grab, and what information should people get out of 30 seconds, I think is one, maybe not where we struggle with the most, but I think where we spend the least amount of our time.
I like your point, Seth. And also, Tommy, I think I'm going to reinforce your point here as well. There's always this concept of what you built the report for initially. Those questions potentially get answered and are off the table. They're no longer questions. And so there's always this concept of what are the regular repeatable questions versus one-time questions. Is there a particular issue we're having right now where I have to address some items? Or should I be thinking about what is that common question I'm always asking? And I think that's also potentially those. Sometimes we build reports for those short one-off questions, exploratory type question answering, whereas longer term, I need to think about how does this, what are those longer repeated questions occurring? And I think that actually changes how your report design builds. And for me, that's where I find I'm building separate pages for those kind of things, or I'm actually building more thin reports, I think, actually. So in those short-term questions that I'm trying to answer, here's a data model, go answer those short-term questions. Here's a standard report. This is now answering those long-term repeatable questions. And I think in my mind, there's some formulation there around building those two types of patterns on how to use your reports. Are we getting close here on time? We're going to skip some. Oh, you want to do hot take, or we're going to? I was going to say let's skip hot take and then go right to final thoughts.
All right.
If you want to end on a hot take,
yeah, and you guys don't have too much explanation, but I just want to go off with 30 seconds.
One. I'm going to give it a 1.
So with the idea of the 30 seconds filter and zoom next, and what the visual is showing, what Kurt's displaying, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say the 30-second area of a visual is the most important area out of the 3, 30, and 300 in terms of what's the most impactful for the user. The 30-second area is the most impactful for the user. I'm giving that a 6.
So of the 3 areas, 3 seconds, users should be able to get an overview. Of the 30 seconds, users should be able to filter and zoom. And then 300 seconds, the users should be able to get details and on demand to inform their decisions and actions.
Most impactful, not the most important, but the most impactful.
What do you mean impactful? What's the difference between important versus impactful?
Important is impactful is they're going to get the most information out of that, the most actionable information.
I'll say, I'm not going to give you a number on this one percent specifically, but I think 300 seconds being able to sit and really think about what's going on. I think that is probably the most actionable item on this one. Most times you don't need all the data to be able to make your analysis. Usually you're looking for a handful of records that make up this is where the sales are down from. This is what information I need to understand that's occurring. So I think filtering, or being able to apply filters to a page and narrow down the data to what you find is most valuable, I think that's incredibly important to use here. So I'd give it, a higher, I'd say of these 3 things, I would say I would probably rank them in order of 30 seconds is probably my most important part of this process.
Okay.
300 seconds is probably my second one. And then 3 seconds, right? An overview of important questions. Yes, it's important, but I'm not going to emphasize that as much, right? The whole goal of this report is to drive for actions and decisions. So I need people to say 300 seconds is still very valuable.
Seth?
He doesn't know how to answer the question because it's a really weird question again.
The most impactful, I think, is pretty straightforward.
It depends on the user. It depends on the data and the report, right? Because I could say the 3 second
how
one.
about for you?
No, for an everyday, if I'm tracking a metric that changes daily and like my sales goal,
then it's a 3 second.
It's a 3 second. So to say one of these is the most impactful largely depends on the report and the audience and what they're using it for. I hope that should I push forth the 3 seconds being the most impactful? Yeah, because then somebody can digest and make decisions off 3 seconds of spending time in my report. To your point, is there a lot of value where instantly hey, my number went up. Who are the accounts, right? Or who was the person who did the work? Is that in my 30-second evaluation? Yes. Right. So do I spend the more time there, or is it fine? I'll give you a 2.
Okay, I'll put you as a yes then. And again, let's put the definition. If words have meaning, this is not Tommy's take. This is a hot take for a reason.
I'll
put you both as a yes then.
Good way of splitting the votes there,
I love how you go 1 to 7. Yes, no is the outcome of what it is. So it's
I think we'll change the rules. No rating. It's got to be a yes or no. Then either you agree it's not an overreaction.
Do I agree with your overarching carte blanche statements that definitively 30 seconds is where the most value is? No, I do not.
Okay, that's fine. We'll maybe modify this to be overreaction Tuesdays or something. So.
Yeah, there we go. With that being said, thank you all very much. We appreciate your time listening to the podcast. This is a valuable hour that you've spent with us. We know you could be doing a lot of other things, washing your hair, cleaning your house, doing some laundry, actually spending time with loved ones and family members. But instead, you choose to spend it with us. We appreciate your time and your ears. So with that being said, if you like this episode, if this found something interesting to resonate with you, please go read the article from SQL BI. Very well written, super impactful. It's like a dissertation in Visual Design 101. It's very well thought out. So Kurt, nice job on that one. Very good job summarizing and kind of thinking through those rules there. Really like that. With that, we only ask that to you, the listener, is if you like this, please share it with somebody else. Let somebody else know that you found some value from this one, and that they should join us on the community here as well. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
Yeah, why you wash your hair? Because that's what people do. You can find us on Apple,
I don't have
Spotify,
any.
wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. If you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode, head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all of powerbi.tips social media channels.
Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.